Hello everyone, and welcome to the technical webinar on Greening Energy Service Stations, a framework to meet United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Amy Jane Lewis, and I'm a technical officer at the Energy Institute for the Energy Transition. I'm very pleased to be here today to help moderate this session. My co-hosts, and you can see their pictures on the screen, include Alexandra Jesus from the EI and consultants Jay and Katie Baker from Arcadis and Paul Needham from Artelia. Just before we commence, I'm just going to go through the webinar housekeeping. So this webinar is being recorded and will appear on YouTube after the event, usually about a week after the event. All participants are muted apart from the speakers. However, we do want this to be an interactive session, so please feel free to post any questions you have in the Q&A function, and they will be answered after the presentations by our speakers today. Just before I hand over to my colleague Alex, who will give the wider context for this webinar, I'm just going to really quickly introduce you to the Energy Institute for those of you who haven't worked with us before or haven't been involved in the work we produce. So, the Energy Institute is a chartered professional membership body of people working within the world of energy, and our mission is to create a better energy future for our members and society by accelerating a just global energy transition to net zero. We meet this mission through three main focuses. The first is around attracting, developing, and equipping a diverse workforce for the future. Then second is around informing decision-making on energy-related issues by convening expertise and advice. The third is enabling energy to be more sustainable, lower carbon, safer, and more efficient. The EI's Technical and Innovation Programme helps to achieve these focuses through publishing good practice guidance, standards, and other resources, including this webinar, across a range of topics to help steward our rapidly changing sector towards a safer, lower carbon future. Following on from this, here are the names of the Energy Institute technical partners who sponsor the technical and innovation work, and there should be some names there that you recognise. If you want to learn more about the Energy Institute and the work we do, please visit the website on the screen, www.energyins.org. Without any further ado, I want to now introduce my colleague Alex, who will give the wider context for this webinar.
Thank you very much, Amy, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Alexandra Jesus, and I'm a Senior Technical and Innovation Officer at the Energy Institute, supporting the Technical Work Programme with focus on the environment and sustainability and learning from incident themes. I have been involved in the development of the Energy Retail Stations Green Guide, which is the topic of the webinar today. And I'll start by giving you an overview of the Environment and Sustainability Technical Work Programme here at the EI and tell you a little bit more about the Green Guide before I hand over to the presenters, just to give you an idea of where this particular work sits within the EI Technical Work Programme. So the Environment and Sustainability Programme sits within the Energy Institute Technical and Innovation Programme and is defined by the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee. The projects are coordinated by a number of technical subcommittees and supported by EI staff. The Environment and Sustainability Committee conducts research aimed at mitigating or eliminating the environmental impacts of the energy industry, and it's spanning across renewables, oil and gas, and clean energy sectors. The program's key focus areas include greenhouse gas and air emissions, which includes methane abatement and quantification techniques, enhancing climate resilience and adaptation, promoting resource efficiency, circularity, and recycling, and the Soil, Waste and Groundwater Committee that developed this piece of work that we're going to tell you a little bit more in a few minutes is addressing soil and groundwater contamination. It's talking about waste and exploring environmental economics. Just a quick mention, so to showcase the work we're doing at the Energy Institute within the Environment Committee, we're hosting a seminar on the 22nd of November at the Energy Institute headquarters in London, and it's open and free to attend. So my colleague will post the link in the chat should you wish to have a look and see if you would benefit from attending in person. Going back to the work program, there are different committees covering different themes. And as I was saying a little bit earlier, the Soil, Waste and Groundwater Group develops technical work related to managing the impact or potential impact of the energy industry upon soil and groundwater, and it has commissioned the development of the Green Guide. Now, the committee wanted to develop guidance to illustrate how petrol stations and storage facilities can be designed, maintained, and operated in such a way in which it could contribute to achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, with particular focus on environment-related goals. So the guide is intended to promote best practice management or good practice management of environmental protection for facilities and all associated activities. And the drive for this work is related to improving energy service site operators' understanding of why environmental protection is important and why at specific sites the sensitivity of specific settings requires stringent controls to prevent pollution, cleanup costs, and reputational risks. So our committee wanted the Green Guide to follow a similar structure to the existing Energy Institute Blue Book, which looks at design, maintenance of service stations from a safety perspective. And also worth mentioning here, for those of you who are familiar with the EI Blue Book or are interested and are going to have a look later on, the green so the Blue Book is currently under development to reflect the energy transition topics. So I think we can move on to the presentation. So Katie J, over to you to share the slides and tell us more about today's topic. And as a reminder, for those of you who have questions during the presentations, please post them in the Q&A section, which should be located at the bottom of your screens. And we do have Paul Needham joining in the Q&A session from Artelia as well. Over to you.
Super. Let me just see if I can share. Are you able to see okay?
All good, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the introduction, and delighted to be here today talking on the behalf of a group of us who came together to support the Energy Institute with this new piece of best practice, this new guidance. Jay Hall is actually our lead author, but as you may be able to see, she's on site today with unreliable internet access. So I've said I will walk us through the slides, but hopefully Jay and Paul, who's also on hand, will be able to help answer any questions or comments that might come at the end of it. So I'm going to take us a little bit through the sustainability journey, but first to say it's been a pleasure to work with the steering group again. I and others from Arcadis have worked with the committee over a number of years on different topics, but this was certainly something as a topic that really intrigued us and required a multidisciplinary remit, because my background is in land contamination, but Jay's background is more in sustainability, and Paul and the team at Artelia's, their background is around energy station design and construction. And actually all those skills were really required to be able to pull this guidance together, because we start at the beginning of the sustainability journey, as you can see on screen now, which is just thinking about the history of what sustainability means to all of us. Going back to 1987, you can see the United Nations talked about sustainability being the need to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Those who have been around in industry in the 1990s, hopefully this is familiar on the left-hand side of the screen, the kind of Venn diagram with sustainability in the center and the triple bottom line model, looking at environment, social and economic factors and getting that balance in terms of decision making. that did start to progress through into the 2000s. So by 2015, a slightly newer way of looking at sustainability had come about with the nested sustainability model, with economics right in the center of the bullseye, but surrounded instead by social and environment. So still very much interlinked decision making, but a different lens. And that really progressed at a global level with the 2016 United Nations publication of the Sustainable Development Goals that you can see on the screen at the moment. And we'll explore those in a little bit more detail. But you can see that they cover a wide range of elements. So this is not just environment, as we now understand. Sustainability is much broader. So things like number 1, no poverty. Number 15, life on land. Number 10, reduced inequalities. So it's definitely the broadest sense of sustainability. So when the SDGs were launched, it was very much intended that they were universal and that they would apply to all countries globally. And in fact, you can see that by 2015, these were adopted by 193 UN member states, covering everything from governments through to multilateral organizations and groups involved in international development. And what they provide is not only the actual list of the goals or the areas, but it provides behind the scenes a 15-year roadmap running from 2015 to 2030 to try and promote sustainable development across all of these different areas. So behind this nice graphic that you can see with the goals, there are a series of targets. And then behind those targets, it goes into further detail for providing measurable indicators. And then behind that again is even more detail around methodology and data, so ways in which positive change can be made. So it's a very, very comprehensive framework, but can be summarized at the highest level with the icons that you can see on the screen. Okay, so what does this mean for industry? Well, we know that there are emerging challenges for industry, a whole host of them, everything from increased carbon emissions and climate change. But those are not the only sustainability issues presenting challenges to industry. When we think about the reporting that takes place into the market around sustainability KPIs, for example, they are quite broad-ranging, and a lot of industry has really struggled with how to capture what this means for them and how to make positive change and sustainable change. But there's been a huge amount of progress in this arena. We know that change is needed. And why is it needed? Well, in part, it's to meet government commitments. In part, it's to meet expectations of the general population, shareholders, for example. In part, it's around improving asset resilience. We need to think about future sustainable development, for example, because of factors such as climate change. We know there's huge changes in population, in demographics, so we need to support those changes, and especially movements of people around the world. And last but not least, to facilitate the ongoing energy transition that virtually all countries across the globe are facing at the moment. So we know that industry is being disrupted in this arena and being challenged around being as sustainable as we can be going forward. We're undergoing major transitions, which I know will be affecting the vast majority of you on the webinar, whether personally within your organization or with support indirectly. We need to help and understand both operators and stakeholders to understand the impact of the facilities that they operate, so the assets that they operate. It's really getting a handle on that helps you then build up a really strong sustainability strategy for positive change. So that was the background, I guess, to understanding the problem that the EI put to market, to say how can we help with one particular area, and that area being energy stations. Broader than petrol stations, but it does include petrol stations, fuel station, gas stations, but we're also looking at other forms of energy provision to vehicles. So hubs for electric vehicle charging, for example, mixed energy source sites, which are becoming more and more common, motorway services, even some local service stations that support local populations. We're now finding mixed energy sources both on the same site, a combination of petrol, diesel, and EV most typically. But we know that there is a lot of disruption expected to energy stations, particularly in the time period that's pertinent for the UNSDG framework. And that's in part because of the changes to what's happening around car manufacture and the different constraints that are coming in, but generally between 2030 and 2035, depending where you are in the world, in terms of a move away from vehicles that are fossil fuel reliant to those that are using a different energy source. So that disruption is already happening. And although we will have those cars on the road, we know that that disruption will continue as many organisations move towards a commitment to net zero by 2050. So even when the UNSDG framework ends in theory in 2030, the same principles and concepts will still apply. So energy stations was what was picked as a good example to try and understand how we can turn that disruption into something to drive positive change, especially around the considering sustainable development opportunities. So you can see on the right-hand side some of the things I've just talked about in terms of the significant changes and the investment in low fossil fuel transport. Some of that change is gradual, but it needs support now. And ultimately, we want to progress towards that transition to a different form of energy, especially for vehicles, but in a way that still has a positive impact as it possibly can be. So quite a large justification for now being the time to develop this guidance to see what can we do around energy stations that's going to have a positive impact. So as Alex mentioned, the starting point for how to think about solving this problem was the Blue Book. So it's been around for a long time. It's had different updates, and it's fundamental to all of those involved in the construction of petrol filling stations, the operating them, the end of life. So the same approach has been adopted for this new bit of guidance. That's on the basis that it's particularly critical to think about how to embed sustainable decisions and sustainable development at concept and planning stage. But there is still possibilities of making changes as the design progresses. There's definitely opportunities for sustainable practices during construction of an energy station. And even for an energy station that's already been built, there are opportunities for improvements in terms of how it's operated, as well as implementing the planned changes or the planned design that was done earlier in the asset life cycle. And then finally through to end of life, whether it's tanks coming out of the ground or just a new use, there are still possibilities there to have a positive impact in terms of the UN SDGs. What becomes evident as you look at this early, and this was something that Jay and the researchers identified and knew from previous examples as well, was that the greatest success really from embedding SDGs comes through the early adoption of sustainable principles. That's primarily on the basis that retrofitting is generally always more challenging, as with so many things in life. So the more that we can think about how we want to design and construct and operate an energy station and in the most sustainable way we can at the start of the process, the easier it is, and usually the cheaper and more efficient it is to be able to implement those changes as you progress through that asset life cycle. The other things to note is that obviously there will be different stakeholders who are likely to be involved in each stage of the process. Some, such as the site owners, are going to be involved throughout the process. Quite often regulators are as well, but perhaps the operator of an asset, of an energy station, may only become pertinent during the operational phase. What is important is that we have different guidance and understanding of the impacts available throughout that asset life cycle, and to understand the uncertainties as we go. So the goal was, therefore, can we come up with a framework that covers all of those stages in the asset life cycle and ties into the broad principles of the Blue Book, and ultimately identify easy trigger points for improvements which we know and can demonstrate will support at least one of the UN SDGs. Before I delve into the detail of some of the examples and how the guidance actually came together, just as a simple example first, if we think about underground storage tanks and how this plays out within the asset life cycle. At concept and planning stage, there are questions we can ask in terms of where you put the tanks, for example. What are they constructed of? When we get into design phase, we've got considerations such as circularity principles that could be brought into play. Why is that important? Well, let's think about end of life at the start of the process. So can we choose the materials for the tanks to be constructed on so that when they do reach end of life, whether that be 20, 30, 50, 80 years time, there's a reasonable possibility for those materials to be recycled, in some cases reused. But thinking about that at the front end means that you don't then put the tanks in the ground that then become more difficult in terms of circularity to minimize waste production. That follows through into construction phase. A whole host of things that we could think about at that point, everything from the plant type used to construct an energy station and put a tank in the ground, through to how we most sustainably manage the soils that come out of the ground in terms of the hole that the tanks are going to go into. And then the operation phase, a lot that can be done with planning as we go through this process, thinking ahead around, well, what are the sorts of alarm systems that are going to be needed to minimize the potential for a leak to ever reach the environment, impacting upon environment-related SDGs, what sort of remote sensing, remote monitoring could be undertaken. And to be fair, a lot of this is really common practice as best practice with service station construction anyway, irrespective of where you are in the world. And then through to end of life, as I've talked about. Is there possibility for refurbishment rather than complete closure? How much of the above ground and below ground with the tanks can be recycled appropriately? And what form of remediation can be undertaken if needed that minimizes the impact from an SDGs perspective? So a whole host of things that can be thought about just for that one particular element of some energy stations. Okay, so we have an understanding, therefore, of where we're trying to get to and the sorts of examples and the framework. So the goal then was to figure out how we turn that into a useful and practical piece of guidance. So we know that we want the SDGs as a framework for actions at each stage in the asset life cycle. We want to be able to demonstrate changes, identify innovation or best practice that's already happening. Where possible, help a reader to create value and align business goals with the UN SDGs. We have pulled out individual targets and measurable indicators within the 17 SDGs. Some are more pertinent than others when it comes to energy stations, for obvious reasons. We wanted each of the sections to be able to be used broadly independently. So if you're at the stage of designing a new energy station or refurbishing an existing energy station and you're in that design phase, you could read that section of the document. If you were coming towards end of life, you could read that section in the document. So yes, they're interlinked, but hopefully it's standalone depending where your asset is in the life cycle. We've done a lot of signposting and cross-referencing for existing guidance. There's a lot of good work out there, and the EI is continuing that, as Alex mentioned. And we wanted to make sure that the principles were applicable to sites across the globe. So yes, there is some UK specific guidance referenced in the guidance, but we have signposted where the sorts of places where comparable guidance can be found elsewhere, and some of the case studies are international as well. So a really complicated looking next slide, but this shows you ultimately what the output looks like at the supporting document that sits alongside the guidance. So in an appendix, what we've done is listed every UNSDG on the left-hand side. We've listed out the target and the measurable indicators, the next two columns, and then you can see along the top concept planning, design, construction, operation, and a lot of text, but ultimately that text is identifying opportunities for having a positive impact for each of those particular elements. So on the left-hand side, we've got ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. The target by 2030 to achieve sustainable management and efficient use of natural resources. We've got a couple of indicators to do with material footprint per capita, and domestic material consumption, etc. And then you can start to see within concept and planning factors such as whole life cycle carbon assessment design for reuse and principles of PAS 2080, BREEAM, LETI, UK, GBC. Conducting meetings using the web where possible. Really small thing, but virtual meetings. That follows through into design features such as sustainable timber for structural frames, sustainable timber or bamboo for wall panels. So really specific ideas, some of which are being implemented already. Through to construction, reuse of items during refurbishments, including light fittings, ovens, chillers, freezers, etc. So as I said before, this is about new facilities, but also when an older facility is being refurbished. And then through into operation, things such as training. So training of staff to ensure monitoring systems are used correctly and maintenance issues are addressed in a timely manner. So this is not just looking at environmental. Hopefully you can see this is covering all different forms of sustainability under a specific UNSDG linked to specific targets. And hopefully then you can start to see the positive impacts that can be made to meet the requirements of the SDGs. So a few more examples that are a little bit more targeted. When we look at the UNSDG life on land, what's an example that's been identified within the guidance? The example pulled out here is planting for biodiversity. So there are things that we can do when we are building or refurbishing an energy station if there is sufficient land to help meet this UNSDG. So diverse planting, providing habitats and food for invertebrates, choosing plants for the landscaped areas on an energy station that offer food sources for birds and pollinators, use a mixture of flowering plants to ensure year-round availability for the wildlife that might be visiting. It's a really small thing, but most energy stations do have some green area at least. So this is the sorts of thinking that can be used to help support that UNSDG. Down the bottom, another one, green roofs. Well, what could that impact on? Life on land, good health and well-being, and responsible consumption. How can it happen? Well, if there's a possibility to use a green roof on an energy station, that provides opportunities for plants and wildlife to thrive in urban areas, contributing to increased biodiversity and ecological balance. It can lead to improved air quality in terms of filtering and purifying the air, capturing pollutants, reducing airborne particulate matter, and it can support with temperature regulation because they can act as natural insulators. So again, just pulling out some of the benefits, the advantages that introducing green infrastructure where it can be done on an energy station could have. And it's really wide-ranging. Let's look at another one then. So this one is around remote monitoring, which is fairly commonly used across industry in terms of monitoring wet stock, for example. But there are a wide range of other above and below ground monitoring and sampling tools that can be used. Examples being during design, groundwater levels and flow direction, for example. So if you're trying to understand the subsurface conditions, planning for what your new asset's going to look like, quite often you have to do a ground investigation to be able to understand what's below ground and make sure that the design is fit for purpose. So monitoring groundwater levels using remote sensors can be undertaken. During construction, you can remote monitor for things like building movement. During operation, we talked about wet stock monitoring, but monitoring electricity usage, for example, to understand where there are peaks and troughs and where that might be able to be refined through change out of certain types of equipment. and obviously I've talked about the product loss detection, which is so common on that form of service station. Just an example on the right hand side. So we do have case studies embedded throughout the guidance. This is a site in the south of England planned for redevelopment. Oils were present in the subsurface, and there was a need to undertake monitoring to understand potential risks to people in the environment. And what you can see on the left-hand side is some top hat monitoring wells with solar panels on that were installed over existing groundwater monitoring wells. And rather than people go to site to check on the amount of product and water level changes over time, which would have been over 80 miles for the nearest person to get to site to do that over several months. Using this remote system resulted in a 60% decrease in miles traveled per month. So you think about the sorts of SDGs that could affect around safety for people, around environmental, around carbon emissions, for example. So just that one thing can affect a huge amount in terms of the SDGs. Okay, another example then, product loss. So not pertinent for all energy stations going forward, but certainly pertinent for a large number of them still while we go through this transition period. You can see that there's a number of UNSDGs that have been pulled out in the guidance, from good health and well-being, clean water and sanitation, industry innovation infrastructure, responsible consumption, and climate action. So all through there, we've got the targets, we've got the indicators, and then we've got the impacts of if leaked product, if a legal product does take place, what are the effects that could be? Because by identifying that, then we can look at the solutions, the best practice that therefore contribute to preventing that taking place and therefore supporting the UN SDGs. So the end result being things such as the design of the tanks to make sure that they are double skinned, the monitoring that takes place, and making sure that there's any early detection to stop it getting to ground in the first place. Okay, coming towards the end, wanted to touch on one case study that was included in further detail within the guidance, which was a service station that has flipped over, switched over and redeveloped as an EV charging point. And the design decisions taken for that change of use had a particular focus on sustainable decision making and then ultimately the sustainable development goals. So the three that were being pulled out at the top that were affected positively are industry, innovation and infrastructure, affordable and clean energy, and sustainable cities and communities. So you can also see in the bullet point list that there are some of the specific targets that have been pulled out. So for example, the canopy was made from sustainably sourced timber rather than steel. And you can see the UN SDG that relates to. PV panels in the canopy roof provided shelter, shading, illumination at night and production of renewable energy. So yes, the obvious being the renewable energy, but it's also that shelter and shading and illumination. And something as simple as illumination plays to this being a safer space. If you've got a site with lots of dark spots, that can encourage unwelcome behavior, people coming together. So having light spaces within the facility helps to make it a safer place for the public to come to. And then a new acoustically enclosed substation to provide a quiet environment for the local community. Really important one, that. You can see down the right-hand side some of the evidence of things that were done as well in support. So and some of the assessment that was done. So carbon dioxide sequestration, for example. Because of the use of timber as the main roof construction material, it was possible to sequestrate approximately 52 tons of carbon into the structure of the building. So this is when you can start to actually get those KPIs or data evidence to demonstrate quantitatively what the impact has been. And some other examples that you can see on screen as well. Okay, so ultimately, the guidance has been developed for energy stations, but the UN SDGs are a framework that can be used broadly and are being used broadly across the world. It's important for us to remember that those are not just climate-related factors. Yes, a lot of attention is focused on that at the moment, but there are a whole range of other SDGs that are important, everything from zero hunger through to reduced inequalities. It's good in that it's not country specific, and hopefully that reflects through in the guidance that that we've worked with the Energy Institute to produce. Yes, there are some UK guidance referenced in there, but the principles we believe are global. We've only got 5 years till 2030, so in theory, at that point, does this cease to become useful? No, for sure not, because the same principles should continue and can be applied beyond that 15-year period that we now have from 2015 to 2030, if not even more importantly. We hope it's really easy for operators, owners, stakeholders involved in energy stations to pick up the guide and look for improvements at any stage of the life cycle that their asset happens to be in. And it can be applied, as I said, for new or for refurbished assets or going through transition. And we do see the potential for cross-application. So this is just one particular example that we've been able to demonstrate, I think, probably more than the steering group even anticipated at the start, how many positive impacts can be made in support of the SDGs when you really delve into the detail of what it means to design and operate an energy station with these principles in mind. It really is, it has been very surprising and encouraging, I think, for all of those involved in the development of the guidance. So I think our takeaway as Arcadis and Artelia is how can we make a difference using this in applying it in different ways, but we would welcome to hear the thoughts of anybody else. With that, I'll say thank you very much. You can see on the screen the primary people that were involved. Jay, obviously, I said at the start. Nigel Griffiths, apologies, that was Paul. Paul Needham on the photo. He was our technical lead and reviewer with a particular background in design and construction of retail stations. Nigel Griffiths and Suzanne from Artelia, and of course Amaya as the project coordinator at the time of the Energy Institute, but all of her colleagues, and last but not least, but to Ruth Chippendale and the Energy Institute EM steering group. With that, I'll say thank you, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Katie. Great presentation. It was very interesting to find out more, and hopefully everyone can take something away from it and is interested in seeing the guide themselves. It's available on the Energy Institute website, and we will share the links to that. We would like to open the Q&A session. So if everyone has any pressing thoughts, questions, please add them to the Q&A tab. And I've seen we already received something in the chat, but as the presentation went along, I think you've already touched on it. It was to do with on-site energy generation. I think who asked it was referring to hydrogen specifically, but I've seen that you touched on the solar panel canopy, which, while generating renewable energy on site, offers shelter, shading, illumination, therefore increasing safety. Is there anything you would like to add on this with on-site energy generation? Katie, Jay?
I can start, but I'm sure Jay and Paul might have something to add as well. I think a lot of the conversations that we had when developing the guidance were on scale. So obviously you can't do everything on every energy site because it depends on the size of the site and what's available, what can be done geotechnically, for example. So yes, solar is an easy one because that's the first one that comes to mind. But depending on where your site is in the scale, there are other opportunities for energy generation as well. But Paul or Jay, looks like Paul's connecting at the moment.
we mostly pointed to other guidance, so existing guidance for implementation of hydrogen and electric and battery storage, so safe provision of electrical storage on sites that might be subject to vibration and things like that.
Thank you. I've seen Paul with his hand up, so please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Oh, good. Okay. I am here. You can't see me. I don't know why the video is not working for me, unfortunately. But yeah, I just think the generation of hydrogen on site, it's quite. The issue is that it's such a new area, and a number of companies have looked into doing generation of hydrogen on site. I don't know how successful it's been, but certainly we have a client who has gone away from doing that because of the logistics involved, plus the sheer amount of electricity that you need to make that hydrogen on site with the use of water. So it then creates a problem for the site, because all the energy is going to deal with production of the hydrogen. Plus, at the moment, there's a limited number of cars that are out there that operate on hydrogen. There's a lot of things to sort out with hydrogen transport, hydrogen generation, and the cars themselves. So I think it is something that's going to come in the future. How the industry deals with it is too young, too new a situation or fuel for industry to actually latch on and say, yeah, this is what we're going to do. So it's emerging, but I don't think it will happen in the near future. I think other things will continue, and you can see that through the Prime Minister's view on what he's going to be doing with cars. So whilst we're talking about doing something, the government is then saying, okay, we'll just slow it down a little bit. And it's a shame, really, because I don't think it can be slowed down. It wants to go the other way. It wants to be speeded up. So it's a difficult one to answer. We haven't done anything in the guidance about production of hydrogen, because I think that's got to be viewed and understood by industry as to how they're going to deal with hydrogen and where hydrogen's going to go and the popularity of hydrogen. There's no point having it if nobody wants to use it. And the other problem is it is it's more explosive than petrol vapors. So it adds another dynamic into it all, that we're actually dealing with something in one way, but we're adding another risk in another approach to it.
Thank you for that, Paul. Hopefully this answer your question. And we did receive another question in the chat referring to what extent is the whole life of assets considered when evaluating their environmental impact? So, for example, if the PV panels require disposal, could they be more of an environmental burden than a benefit? Who would like to take this?
Jay, is that one you want to touch on? I guess we haven't gone into the details necessarily of doing all the embedded carbon calculations in the guidance, have we? But Jay, I'll hand over to you.
We pointed at there's various different tools. So in, I think, the planning chapter, it goes into some of the different tools that are available for doing those whole life cycle carbon calculations. So it points towards various different techniques that can be used to do that sort of exercise, and it explains the rationale for taking that approach.
I think the other thing is something like PVs. There'll be some UNSDGs that it has a positive impact, and others, depending on that whole life cycle evaluation, may be negative. So it's not that everything that's put forward will necessarily be positive for all the UNSDGs. They might be neutral, might be positive, might be negative. So I think it is that holistic view, but it's breaking down into each of the targets to see where positive impacts can be had. That's important. in trying to understand how they support different SDGs, if that makes sense. It's a good point, though.
Thank you for that. Thanks both. There is a question on. There is a question on whether the approach or methodology set out within the guidance could be applied to other operations in the energy sector, so not limited to the scope of this the scope you've spoken.
I think the answer is absolutely. I think some of the research and the findings will be directly cross-applicable. So you could read this through the lens of a different form of energy site, and still a lot of the learning around the design, for example, would be pertinent. What would be different is some of the details where it's a very different sort of asset that's being constructed, and or when there is different background guidance. So the guidance that we've referred out to for energy stations is very much focused on energy stations. As Jay said, the guidance and tools to do with looking at carbon, for example, are across all sectors. So there's definitely bits that could be cross-applied directly, but then I think it would need some looking at for some of the detail for when it's a very different form of energy setting, energy asset, to fine-tune to be able to cross-apply.
That makes perfect sense. Yes, thank you. And we've talked a lot, well, you've talked a lot about UNSDGs and while conducting the research and writing up the guidance, was it evident from research that there is a wide knowledge or understanding of UNSDGs? How did that come across?
Jay, I'll let you cover that because I know you were doing that preliminary research into it.
I think a lot of people just see the squares and they just stop considering it beyond then, and they don't realize that there are these big lists of hundreds and hundreds of goals and targets and statistics that every country who's subscribed to these UN SDGs has to report, and that the UN SDGs get updated on a regular basis as well to keep up with targets and how well different countries are meeting different targets. So the UN SDGs are actually being updated in 2025, so we can see whether there's any new targets that are going to be included in that. But yes, I think a lot of people just weren't aware that there was a background behind these other than just their colourful squares with nice messages. But there is actually a framework for improvement that countries are subscribing to. So I think that aspect of it really needs to be made clear, and the fact that you can have a big table, as we've done, breaking it down into individual targets with individual metrics that people at all different stages of the industry can use is very powerful.
I'm not aware from the research that we've done, and Jay, correct me if I'm wrong, of seeing evidence for government approaching industry to say this is the commitments. What as industries, energy and other industries, what are you doing to support these? So that's the slight frustration that this guidance is being driven by industry wanting to make a positive change, but we're not seeing it coming the other way for whatever reason. Perhaps that's just from where we've seen it from. Others on the webinar might have a different perspective. But it feels like if there was better communication between industry and government on that, we'd probably have a better chance of capturing the successes and driving change.
A very powerful thought there. Perhaps this one is a question for Paul, but anyone is welcome to take it. Is there a view on quick wins when it comes to construction opportunities on sites that could contribute to the UN framework?
I think the biggest quick win that could be considered, but it needs a lot of upfront planning, will be using modular construction on petrol filling stations, But the problem you've got with that is that we need to have every part of the station in terms of the shop using modular construction needs to be the same for each site. And the problem with that now is that we are finding more and more that existing sites are very constrained. So we end up with every petrol station not being standard. And that is really the thing that you need when you're dealing with modularization. So that is a constraint that makes it very difficult for us. But if we were on lots of much bigger brownfield sites, hopefully we'd be using brownfield sites, then we would be able to try and do that. Problem being, though, is all of the not the retailers, but all of the companies, the operators, owners of these sites, want to ensure that they're able to adapt all the time. So actually, it limits them in how they can adapt and change their business for what the customer wants. So their focus is all about what's the customer value proposition that we want to put forward to our customers. But if you're constraining them with a modular arrangement, it's very difficult for that to get adapted and developed. So that's kind of like a bit of a negative for companies to take it forward. But that would be a big easy win if you could do all of that, because that just does away with so many of the issues around materials, transport. Everything just comes on the one lorry rather than lots of different trades turning up. So you get loads of materials getting driven there, loads of different trades going there, as opposed to 4 lorries turn up with the modularized units on the back and get put on site. The only problem with modularization is at the end of those modules' lifespan, what do you do with them? Because that's it. They're kind of like past their age, and you've got to deal with them and dispose of them correctly. And that all takes energy. That all takes things getting moved around. But I think that negative does not outweigh the benefits if you could do it. So that's one quick win. I think the other quick win would be if it was a consistent approach in terms of what's the energy we're going to use. Are we doing all EV or are we doing hybrids? And unfortunately, that's not going to happen for a few years yet.
Thank you, Paul. Anything else that you'd like to add here, KJ?
There was one question on the chat just around car washes and how you can design and build them, operate them to minimise the potential for release to subsurface. So the sorts of things that I'd noted down was, right from the start, is it possible to review the design in terms of the actual detergents used, for example? So is it possible to design out the potential for using products or chemicals that are of concern for the environment? And also in the design stage, looking at the most effective containment measures so that water has the least chance to get to ground in the first place. And then throughout the operation phase, having an effective monitoring process in place to make sure that any potential breaches or risk of breaches are picked up and remedied before they can take place, and training to the operators on the facility so that they know what to watch out for, and if the worst does happen, how to respond, and to understand that yes, it's not the same as a product loss to the environment, but it doesn't mean it isn't still a loss to the environment that needs to be looked at and managed appropriately. So it's that education piece as well.
There is a bit, you just talked about car washes, Katie. There is a bit in the guide that talks about car wash, and it is very much about minimizing the use of detergents and least such as plant-based cleaning agents that we've got to get them into. The problem we've got with car washes that get put onto site is quite often they get built on site and connected by operators straight into the storm drain, and there's no control of what's going down the storm drain. And I do worry about, you know, a lot of the adverts that are out there. We can do all this stuff on a cold wash. We've got this new detergent that we're using. Well, to me, that all smacks of a stronger detergent that's being used. So it's still going to go down the drain. It's still going to get into the water courses, still going to get into the whole environment cycle. So it does bother me a little bit. I think the best thing to do is just have no car washes. But I'm sure the operators wouldn't agree with that.
Thank you, everyone. I'm just looking in the chat, and it seems like there are no other burning questions. If anything else comes to mind, please feel free to reach out at the Energy Institute to address any queries you may have. And just as a reminder, we'll send out a post-event email, including all the useful links from this session. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank everyone once more for joining, and special thanks to our presenters today. And unless there's anything else you'd like to add, I'll hand over to Amy to wrap up the session.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, just to reiterate, if you've enjoyed this webinar, there have been other technical webinars in this series, as you can see on screen, on topics such as hydrogen, tripod light, safety on, methane guiding principles, and they can all be found on the EI's YouTube page. The next technical webinar in this series is taking place next Wednesday, on the 8th of November, slightly different topic, on the EI PSM framework, but please feel free to register if you're interested. Registration is still open. Yes, just visit the What's On page. On a slightly different note, but a very exciting event is happening at the International Energy Week. It's taking place at the end of February 2024 at the Intercontinental in central London. And if you're interested in this event, please visit the website on screen. But yes, just a massive thank you for everyone for attending, especially the consultants for taking their time. Yeah, massive thank you, and hope to see you in another technical webinar.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye. Have a good rest of the day.